Canadian political leaders gathering to discuss how to defend this country's interests in Ottawa today, with Donald Trump's inauguration set for Monday. Our guest says Trump's claims that Canada is subsidized by the United States are laughable. And he says, in fact, Canada is the one subsidizing the US. Let's get more from Jim Standford, economist and director at the Centre for Future Work. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Jim. Give us the main points of your argument, or main one or two points. For one thing, you say we have to take services into account as well as goods.
Absolutely. The numbers that Donald Trump is throwing around about the size of the bilateral deficit are quite simply made up. He says it's $200 billion. It isn't remotely $200 billion. When you count merchandise and services, and remember, the Americans have a huge advantage in services trade because they've got the biggest banks, the biggest tech companies, the biggest streaming companies, etc. The deficit was $40 billion, one-fifth Trump's claim in 2023, and it shrank further in 2024. So his number is wrong, first of all, but more importantly, his economic theory is just off the wall. A trade deficit with Canada means we sell them a little bit more than they sell us on an enormous two-way trade. Andy, it's $1 trillion a year crosses the border both directions. So the 40 billion is very small, and it's not a subsidy. It's just the fact that, you know, the competitive flows have pushed the U.S. to buy from us. There are ways that I think we do subsidize the United States through some very sweet deals in the trade relationship that benefit them.
One thing I remember hearing years ago was that we tend to export cattle or unprocessed meat to America, and that in some cases we buy back processed meat, and so they get to add the value. Is that true in other areas, Jim?
Oh, absolutely. That analogy that we sell them the raw materials, they manufacture them into value-added goods that, by the way, are quite a bit more expensive than the raw materials, and then sell it back to us. That happens across the spectrum. You know, even energy, we export energy and we import from the United States lots of refined petroleum products, actually in some cases refined with our oil. The same goes for manufactured goods, technology, and so on. So our report that we released this week estimated 76% of the merchandise exports that we sell to the Americans are unfinished goods of various kinds: raw materials, minerals, lumber, agricultural products, parts, semi-finished goods, machinery, etc. So it isn't like we sell them stuff that goes on the shelf in Costco, and then the tariff, if they implement it, would create more space for American businesses. Quite the opposite. What we sell is used by American businesses to produce their own stuff, including stuff they sell to the rest of the world, including back to us. That's how this will be a self-inflicted wound for American business.
Do you really think will Trump push ahead? I mean, there was talk this week that they'll phase it in, these tariffs, and use it as a negotiating club.
Andy, I've got no more insight into the workings of Trump's brain than anyone else in Canada. Of course, we've been scratching our heads. Why would they do something that's so self-evidently destructive, not just to a rules-based trading system, but to their own businesses' competitiveness? Is it just a bullying tactic to create leverage? Is it, in fact, part of a bigger expansionist dream that he's talking about? Maybe he actually does want to go down in history as the president who expanded the United States. I don't know. What I do know is that I think Canadians, first of all, can be more forceful in rejecting this claim that we're somehow a charity case. They do not subsidize us. They benefit from our trade at least as much as we do. And then secondly, be prepared to play the deterrence game, which means we have to be ready to hurt them as much as they're hurting us.
Another point you're making is that bilateral trade deficits, in that Canada may have a small surplus, but it's just dwarfed by America's deficit with China or Mexico or lots of other places.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Andy, remember, the U.S. has had a trade deficit for 49 straight years, and it's a safe bet it'll be 50 this year. This is a structural feature of the U.S. economy. There's nothing new about it. It's not an emergency. It's par for the course. And in fact, the trade deficit has shrunk relative to U.S. GDP in recent years. How do they do it? They do it because there's an ongoing massive capital flow into the United States from foreign investors and lenders who want to put their money in U.S. assets because it's the world's reserve currency and considered a safe haven. And by the way, Canadians do that too. We've given them now $700 billion worth of low interest loans over the last decade that more than offsets the value of that much smaller trade deficit with us. So in terms of their major trading partners, their deficit with Canada is very small. We have the 10th largest trade deficit of all their bilateral relationships. It's about 1/6 the size of China. Their deficit with China is a quarter the size, or less than a quarter the size, their deficit with Mexico. So first of all, the trade deficit period for America is not an emergency. It's not new. Secondly, Canada is the last country that you'd have on the most wanted list for Trump's strategy.
Now, we know that Canada's moved ahead with a digital services tax that affects America's Silicon Valley giants, and apparently that is annoying the powers that be in Washington. There's been a suggestion we might throw Trump a bone by removing it. What would you, and get concessions from him that way? What would you think of that move, Jim?
Yeah, I think it's true that digital services tax is a poker chip in this game. Remember, it's not a giant thing. It's 5% if I have it right. And this is because that digital cross-border trade that I was mentioning, everything we buy from Meta and Google and Netflix and Amazon and Uber, the good chunk of that is an export to us from an American company. And it doesn't even show up in the trade data. So, that smaller number for the trade deficit is probably overestimating the true deficit because most of these U.S. Digital exports aren't even counted. But secondly, they aren't taxed. And this is one of the ways that we subsidize the Americans, because the digital nature of the trade has so far allowed them to avoid the normal taxes that other businesses pay. They're getting a free ride. The digital services tax was a first step to try and close that loophole, and frankly, not a big one, but it is a dangerous precedent in the eyes of, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the other tech bros who hang out at Mar-a-Lago. So I think they will definitely be pushing for Trump to be getting rid of that Canadian tax as one of the first orders of business when these negotiations start.
I guess we could, as I've heard a suggestion, we could cancel it, and that would give Trump the win that he always likes to proclaim. Jim, we better jump. Have you a final thought very quickly, or?
Well, I mean, if you're playing poker, you don't show the other side all the cards that you got. So why would we start making concessions before the talks even start? And obviously, Daniel Smith tried to do that by tripping down to Mar-a-Lago and saying, please, please exempt us. And that isn't how Trump rolls. So I think we're going to have to be big boys and stand up tall, put out our chests and be as brave as we can, and recognize this whole catastrophe will hurt in aggregate. It will hurt Americans as much as it hurts us. And by the sick logic of mutual assured destruction, that actually gives us some bargaining power.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. Jim Standford, economist and